You are listening to Nerd Best Friends, because honestly, like you have something better to do other than being a nerd.
Hey everybody, welcome to a second part of episode 2. This is the 1980s nerd culture television shows, which we took too long getting through the movies. This last ep, we turned episode 2 into part 1 and part 2, much like Back to the Future did. So here is part 2 of episode 2.
Much like the premise of the entire show, we wanted to have nerd conversations, and it turns out nerds can talk for a long time. So we're going to break this one up into 2 parts for you.
I think we can kind of gloss very quickly over our more popular and well-known TV shows. And these really popular ones kind of fit into some of the same categories, right? We have Extraterrestrial in Elf, which started in 86. We have Mork and Mindy, which started in the late 70s, but went into 80s. And that's Robin
Another
Williams,
Alien movie. Right?
Alien, and funny because he doesn't know.
It's a fish out of water story, right? And everything that the girlfriend or, the roommate or whatever and her friends take for granted, he turns on its ear and does something wrong with it. Right?
Well, it's definitely a play for words. And I think one of the reasons why there's some on our obscure list that I really liked is just the idea of how literal they are. Mork is a very literal person. And it's just that trope of, haha, they don't understand human culture. And then you get the Twilight Zone, which is actually a series from the late 50s that went on for years. It's like another Simpsons that was still on in the 80s and going into the 90s. But it had just like Star Trek, had a movie in the 80s that kind of re-kicked and reinvigorated Twilight Zone. You have Quantum Leap. There's more on that space-time continuum. Such a great show. You have Macgyver, which is embracing the nerd itself. Right?
Yes, he is the engineer nerd, right? There is no situation he can't get out of with his smarts and with building some little gadget, right? The joke is, a paperclip and some duct tape, and he could take down the terrorist organization or whatever. A lot of times it was a little bit more complicated than that. A lot of times it was like a survival thing where, he got buried in the avalanche and he has to use his ski pole and his jacket and the zipper to make a parachute and signal people. Like, it's so good.
It's amazing. And I didn't know this. I didn't remember this about the series, but he's actually fundamentally against guns and violence, which is why as a special agent, he doesn't carry one.
Exactly.
There's a lot of really popular TV shows from the 80s we can mention. We talked about some of them earlier that aren't really on the nerdy side, things like Married with Children and Roseanne. I put 2 on this list. They aren't nerdy shows, nerdy sitcoms, but I put Three's Company and Bosom Buddies on the list for 2 reasons. We talk a lot about tropes. Three's Company falls under that trope that Elf and Mork and Mindy and Small Wonder fall under, in that it was formulaic. Three's Company stars this guy who pretends to be gay so he can live in an apartment building that's all for women, and he convinces the landlord he's not going to want to be with the women romantically because he's gay. So you have an interesting but very could be seen as homophobic representation of what a gay man is. He turns flamboyant and he pretends to hit on all the guys. But it was a representation in the 1970s and early 80s of a homosexual man that really didn't exist at the time. So it was also very envelope pushing. But the trope for that show was someone overhears something that's a sexual innuendo, and the whole rest of the episode is about the misunderstanding around that innuendo and then it getting resolved in the end. The same can be said. It is really bad, but
it's so bad.
It really encapsulates what television shows were in the 1980s, especially some of the obscure ones that we're going to talk about next. And then I put Bosom Buddies on there. It's one of the first things Tom Hanks ever starred in, and he plays. He lives with this other guy, and again to affordable housing for women only. So he and his friend cross-dress. Was considered cross-dressing in the 1980s. They're not transgender. They cross-dress and pretend to be women so that they can live in this building. So also very tropey. I don't know. Did you ever watch this show?
Bosom Buddies? Yes, I remember totally enjoying Bosom Buddies for whatever reason when I was a kid. That was a show we watched, and it's not good.
No, it's not.
It's a joke that can last one episode, maybe 5, and it stretched to how many seasons?
Yes.
Just spinning out of control.
And the same
Very
idea
strange.
where something zany happens as a misunderstanding, and they spend the rest of the episode trying to fix it. So, or addressing it or not fixing it because they don't know that the misunderstandings happened. Moving away quickly from those more popular shows of the 80s, let's talk about some of these obscure ones. And actually, I want to start with the second one on our list because we both had it on our list.
Yes.
My Secret Identity.
My Secret Identity, starring a young Jerry O'Connell as a kid who has superpowers, but they're not perfect. They're
not great.
They're an allegory for like puberty and being a nerd kid in high school, right?
Yeah.
Like he can levitate, but he can't fly. It's not cool. He has to use like hairspray bottles,
aerosol cans,
just scoot himself around while he's levitating because he's not really a superhero. What else did he have? He had super strength, right?
He did not have super strength. Actually, the synopsis made very clear that was one thing he wished for the 3 seasons that it existed. He can levitate, and as the series goes along, his flying, quote unquote, gets a little bit better, but he always has those aerosol cans with him. Mm-hmm. He has invulnerability or invincibility. Okay. So he can't be hurt, and he's got super speed. If you remember, they would use the special effect to make it look like he's running around really fast. But he never.
Oh my gosh, yes, because he had to be in school, but then he had to excuse me, go to the bathroom, and then run home to go do something else, and then okay, mom, I'll be right back, and then zoom over to talk to the girl he liked, and then zoom back to the
yes. Oh my gosh. Then the invulnerability or invincibility is displayed right in the first episode because the new girl moves across the street and she's all mysterious and he wants to get to know her. And you've got the Jerry O'Connell, if you remember from Stand By Me, he's the chunky kid. And here's Jerry O'Connell entering pubescence himself. So he's still got a little bit of chunk, but he's also a skinny kid. In the very first out. Yes, in the very first episode, he takes off his shirt while he's mowing the lawn and sucks his gut in to turn to the new neighbor girl. And he ends up having to save her life because she's witness protection. I went back and watched the first episode on YouTube, and there he is with this Russian dude who's trying to kidnap her, and the Russian dude's just punching him, and he turns and gives that Jerry O'Connell smile. And he puts his hand on his hips and tries to pretend he's a superhero so he can save the girl. And then she's gone. End of the episode. They have to take her away, witness protection. But that super strength. It's not a great show, but it's so much fun. And
it was must watch for me when I was a
absolutely
kid. I never missed an episode of My Secret Identity.
It was just a lot of fun to watch.
You'll never guess my secret identity.
Thanks a lot. It took me 3 days to get that theme song out of my head after I watched the episode.
80s synthesizer.
Yep. Gosh, and how about we can do a whole episode on theme songs in the 1980s because they were phenomenal. That leads us to the one I put on. Did you ever watch Small Wonder? Nope.
Okay. Yes and no. I think it came on after Charles in Charge, so sometimes I would watch a little bit of it and be like, all right, I got to go do my homework now or whatever.
Yeah, it's a weird one, and I don't know why I watched it, to be really honest with you. It is also not great, and again, this wouldn't be done today because it's kind of creepy. Small Wonder is about this robot scientist who gets frustrated at work because his boss takes the credit for all of his work, and his boss is his neighbor, so he constantly has to interact with him and pretend everything's okay. He creates a robot girl and then decides to see if he can pass her off as his adopted daughter. So the whole family's in on this joke that see if he has this advanced ability to make this robot human, and this poor little kid acting like a robot. And they try to pass her off as this kid. And then there's a little nosy neighbor who's got a crush on the son of the robot guy family. So she's always snooping around, trying to get around him. Right. And they always,
very bewitched, very
much so. And
I Dream of Jeannie.
And here's that trope from Three's Company. It's not sexual innuendo, but there's a literalness to it. And me being the word person I am, I think that's what appealed to me. I also went into YouTube and I went down a rabbit hole this last week. This is no joke. I just started thinking about all these shows and watching episodes on YouTube. There's a moment where the mom of the family tells the robot, whose name is Vicky, she's like, Vicky, honey, will you throw these dishes in the sink for us? And she picks them up and she walks over and throws them in, and they just break. You can see the sink breaks and the dishes break. And it's just, she's being very little. She's a robot. She doesn't understand human, verbiage. And that's that Mork and Mindy, that's that Three's Company, but then made for family sitcom television for ha 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 laughs. So not a great TV show, but I recommend watching an episode or two if you want to look at that nerdy science alien robot type trope that was a big thing in the 80s.
Would you say with a lot of those shows that kind of had that trope and that character in it, one, is there a connection? Two, if there was a connection, were those shows just making fun of autistic and differently abled people? Or three, was it trying to represent autistic and differently abled people in that way?
You know, that's a good question. If we think about, well, we're both educators, so we've dealt with students and children developing or having been developed on the autism spectrum. I don't know that we knew about it enough in the 80s and that we could describe those characters or those intentions as being a depiction of an autistic person. That's a good question. I personally don't see it, but also I see a show like Small Wonder, a show like
Mork and Mindy
really being made just for families and being made in a way that, again, encapsulated robot nerds. Here's this guy who made a robot. What is it like to have a robot in a family, and do it in a way that's appeasable to family sitcom television? If there is some of that, I don't know that it would have been intentional, because we do actually have shows in the 80s that depict special needs characters. There's the one with the kid, the character name is Corky.
Right.
And I can't remember the name of the show.
And it had the Beatles theme song. And
yes.
It was called...
It's right there. And I
Stand By Me. It was... Life Goes On.
Yes, good memory. Life Goes On. So we definitely had shows like Life Goes On, but I will say it was much more acceptable to have that strange,
that was
weird,
very purposeful and representative, because there was an actual, like, the actor was playing
actually,
themselves and those kind of things. So that was a big difference. And I'm wondering if that was kind of who knows? Someone knows, or has a better theory than me just coming up at the top of my head. But I'm like, if I think about Robin Williams, was he really just making fun of people? I
think Robin Williams is a uniqueness by himself that we could discuss. I will say, of all of these things we've talked about, I could see a show like Small Wonder being made today in a different way. It wouldn't be the guy making a young daughter. It would be him. It's
called Dollhouse, and it's awesome.
Okay, see, Dollhouse is amazing, but she doesn't have that same trope of literal, right? Dollhouse is so good. But I think you could take a piece of Small Wonder and plug it into a sitcom for Netflix or for Hulu that has that same alien robot, not from here, not fitting into the culture that we know it now. And there is actually a Netflix show that is a little bit about that, and I'm gonna not remember the name for the life of me. I've not watched it yet, but it's about these three teenagers from the 90s who die. They're in a little like garage band, like Seattle garage type band in the 90s, and their ghosts come back today. And they don't know anything about cell phones and technology and things along those lines. And there's a character or two that interacts with them, making their music popular again. And I'm not going to know all the storylines because I didn't actually watch it, but there's that idea. Granted, they're not robots, they're not aliens, but they're clearly from a different time. If you plugged us from 1990 into 2021, our minds would be blown at what's available. I mean, I'm talking to you through a computer.
But that's a fish out of water story. That's not this person acts like they have some sort of malfunction because they're taking things literally, or they don't understand nuance, or they don't understand social cues.
Okay. Right? That's interesting. That's a good thing to ponder. I don't know that we have the answer to that. And I'm going to venture to say it wasn't intentional. That we can look at it now, 34 or almost 40 years later. You're right. We can look at it now and say, wow, those are really signs of people who are on the autism spectrum. I wouldn't imagine that was purposefully the case at the time, except maybe they knew that it was and did it anyways because it's funny and nobody really cared. That's a good point.
Okay. And then did you want to talk about Parker Lewis Can't Lose?
I had it on the list because it started 1990. It wasn't quite in the 80s, but to me, it was one of those transition shows between what TV was like in the 80s and what TV turned into in the 90s. I will say the most important part about it, and the reason to bring it up, is that it was the type of show that I think appealed to nerds. The three guys in it thought they were popular guys. They're not really popular guys, and they're trying to be popular. But it's not the storyline itself. It's the way the story was portrayed. In the way you talked about The Matrix and Jurassic Park, this television show was zany. It was out there. It told stories in these snippets that sometimes you got them out of order and you had to wait for the end joke or the end scenario. It really just changed. For me, I felt like a nerd watching it. And that's what I remember watching. I watched the first episode of this as well, and it's not a great show. I actually don't necessarily recommend it. But if you want to see that bridge between what shows were like for kids in the 80s, and you're Saved by the Bells and you're all these more popular kid shows, to teenagers who aren't quite popular. I mean, they talk about synchronizing swatches. Right. We're going to synchronize our swatches and then but it's being told in the first person by the main character, Parker Lewis, and just his misadventures in either middle school or beginning of high school.
The Transformers cartoon in 1994, absolutely fantastic. I mean, yes, this was made to sell toys, but those toys were super great. What if, kids love toy trucks, but what if the toy truck also turned into an awesome robot with a gun? Yes, please. Like, this is a perfect melding of, Japanese influence of like giant robot kaiju monsters and just the American love of cars and trucks and speed and things like that. They were alien, and they had these two forces. The premise of Transformers is it was a world at war, and there was an arc of people, of, the Autobots, the good guys, who had to escape their planet because the bad guys, the Decepticons, had taken over in this dictatorship, fascist regime, and their ark crash landed on Earth, and it had been boarded. The reason it crashed is because it had been boarded by enemy force. And so it just lay dormant from the time of the dinosaurs until modern technology caught up to, just like Godzilla is woken up by the first atomic bomb test, right? Okay. The Transformers were woken up by oil drilling and these kinds of things that we were doing. And their war continued on Earth as these little skirmishing factions because it was just in their nature. So cool. And they look cool, and they always looked cool. Like every iteration as it goes through the decades, it's just cool.
And they did a really good job with the product itself, the making of Transformers, to make them realistic. I would watch this cartoon all of the time. I couldn't ever tell you what that overarching plot was. It was just a really cool show to watch. I never really got into the storyline. The lore. Movies. Yeah. No, definitely was not a fan of it, but I was a fan of the Transformers. My brothers all had the toys, and I would get to play with them too.
And it was cool to be a 5-year-old and like bring up a truck on the kitchen table and be like, watch this, grandma, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, 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 like a Rubik's Cube. And now it's a robot. Like, yes. This is great.
Transformers is great. And I don't know about the newer movies. It's cool to see it with CGI technology, but
spectacle. They're not good, but if you love Transformers, they're fun to watch, to see the cool robots and the transforming into they're not good.
Right.
They're kind of cool. The other one I want to touch on real quick is Pirates of Darkwater. This was an early 80s cartoon. It was high fantasy to the nines. The main character is like an elf, and he's got darker skin, and he's got a little like fairy dragon, and he's got a girlfriend, and they're sailing around trying to find treasure. And there's like a force. There's like a big fat bad guy pirate and all his henchmen. And they have this huge pirate ship that's all like made out of bones and stuff, like Pirates of the Caribbean style. And it was a week to week adventure show where every week was a self-contained thing, but there was this over arc. They were trying to find don't know if it was what the number was. I want to say 13, like the 13 treasures of Darkwater.
Okay.
And every episode, the premise was, oh, we're going to this place because we have a map that shows that one of the treasures is here. And oh, here come the bad guys. And also there's some kind of plot conflict on the island we're going to, or this part of the sea we're going to. So there was always this kind of three-way battle going on. But this is where I learned how to do Dungeons and Dragons storytelling. When I watched this show and I was in 6th grade, and then I found out there was a thing called role-playing games, I'm like, oh, you have to collect the 13 treasures, and everywhere you go, the story gets a little bit bigger, and then you try to win. That is how I developed my gaming storytelling, was absolutely this show.
That is amazing. I have never heard of Pirates of Darkwater.
Nobody has.
So I'm gonna look for it on YouTube. I'd love to see it, but that makes a lot of sense on how that overarching storyline piece with there's all those little threads on each little act, if you will, as you go along. And I was going to ask you, do they find the 13 and go, but don't tell me, because if I find it, maybe I'll watch some of it. That's a great, great mention. The finale. I mean, this is probably, in my opinion, one of the best nerdy shows of the 1980s.
Absolutely has ruined me for superpowers, for comic books, for heroes. Like, how many times you go to some dumb meeting and there's an icebreaker of, would you rather have super strength or be able to would you rather turn invisible or be able to fly? What do you think is the best superpower? Like, all those dumb things. The answer is always, I want the power of the girl from Out of This World.
From Out of This World. I mean,
it's
you're
the
absolutely
greatest
right.
superpower in the ever conceived and thought about.
Agreed. For those who have not seen it, Out of This World revolves around a teenage girl on her 13th birthday, finds out she's half alien and her dad is living on a different planet because he's a pilot astronaut guy and he's fighting a war, and that's why he's been gone for her 13 years. She finds out that she also has secret powers that she will gain and develop as she gets older. And the very first pilot episode, she learns that she has the ability to freeze time, and not just freeze it, but completely stop it and be the only thing still living, moving, and breathing at the moment. I mean, they don't die, but you know what I mean.
They all pause, right? They all do, and because it's a show, they all just like stop their bodies, like freeze frame, and which is super hilarious because you can always catch them like shaking or blinking or whatever if you look hard enough. But she imagine taking your 2 index fingers and touching the tips of your fingers together, and there's a little sound effect, or maybe was there even like
it's like a little chime? No, it's not on her fingers, but just a chime, a little ding,
and everything stops except you. And so you have as much time in the world as you want to go about your day and do whatever you need to get done. But also, if you take a flat hand and you touch another person, you unfreeze them from time so that they can be in the same time stop world as you are.
And she discovers that on accident. I don't know if you remember, like, because I went and watched the first episode. She discovered an accident because it's her 13th birthday party, and she stands up and she like gets all serious and like just starts staring at her fingers as they move closer to each other, and she's freaking out because everything stopped. Like, there's a guy who was pouring some water into a cup, and that's frozen, and the clock's frozen. So she freaks out and grabs her mom, and that's how her mom unfreezes, and they figure it out.
Super cool resin prop of water pouring and stop there. And then she unfreezes time by like not like clapping loudly, but she puts her 2 flat palms together, and that will unfreeze time. This is the greatest superpower ever.
Absolutely.
There is no problem that you cannot solve with this superpower.
But so here's what made this show tropey, however, because if you go back to that Three's Company trope, the series itself largely revolves around her misusing that freezing time and then spending the rest of the episode fixing it back up, whatever it is that she messed it up by freezing time. So I read in again, rabbit hole of the internet, there's an episode where she loses the power. Her dad takes it away because she abused it. She also gets 2 more powers during the series. She can gleep objects into existence. So she can, and I think that was towards the end of the show because I don't remember that at all.
I don't remember that.
And she can transport herself. I do remember that she had to think carefully about how to transport
you don't even need to unfreeze the airplane pilot while your time is frozen so he can take you to Moscow and you can stop the terrorists while they're all frozen.
Nope, you can transport yourself.
Transport yourself there.
But you could freeze
none of
time.
that cool stuff happened. It was all like in the confines of the like 3-walled set of their house. Like it almost never left their living room or her bedroom as I remember it.
In school, I think, but she just, I can't remember if she was ever at school, but it really, like these powers revolved around a teenage girl. Out of this world, also very uncommon to tell this story of superhero powers from the perspective of a teenage girl, because her pubescent experience and what she would pause time for is absolutely different than what a 13-year-old boy would freeze time for. Think about your son. What would he freeze time for right now versus what a 13-year-old girl would freeze time for? Right? I can imagine if the internet was still live and you froze time, I could see Andrew freezing time and playing the heck out of his video game for hours and hours and hours and hours.
My real son, it would be like, hey, 5 minutes and you got to turn the games off. Freeze time,
Bing.
Play for another 3 hours, be a total zombie, and then, okay, I'm tired, I'll put it back together.
Yep.
TV kid, obviously, freeze time, go sneak into the girls' locker room because it's the 80s.
Yeah. Right. I didn't know this at the time, but on that 13th birthday, she gets this little cube that opens up and allows her to communicate with her dad. Her dad is Burt Reynolds as the voice of Troy, her father.
I had no idea. I didn't
know
that at all.
So that's a fun fact. But Burt Reynolds, uncredited because he was doing a favor to his friend who created the show. And he's never credited in the series for being the voice of. And in the opening credits, you actually never see the father, Troy. A couple of times he appears. They don't ever show his face. And he's eventually in the opening credits for his 3 in-person appearances. It's Troy as himself. They never give an actor a credit for the show. And what I didn't know and don't remember is the show actually ends on a cliffhanger and was not renewed. And the cliffhanger was he actually the dad, Troy, gets to come home and he's like getting to spend time with the family. And the mom accidentally gets taken back in his place. And that's how the series ends.
So good. Such a good power set.
And given to a 13-year-old girl, to me, I'm just going to say again, so unique and so good. So, Rob, what is the nerdiest thing you did this week?
Oh boy, the nerdiest thing that I did this week is, I actually was talking about this on the last episode, I started a big project where I have these board games. They're made by WizKids. They're Dungeons and Dragons themed. It's called the Adventure System. And there's a bunch of different boxes: Castle Ravenloft, The Legend of Driss, The Tomb of Annihilations. And it's all the same premise. There's a big deck, like cards that are puzzle piece squares, and they have a grid and little pictures on them, and you build a dungeon ahead of your little minifigs as you go. So you move your guy to the edge, you draw a random card, it fits in like a puzzle piece, and then monsters show up or events happen, and there's always a goal: find this tile and kill this monster at the end, kind of thing. And they're really fun games. They look cool, and they play pretty quick. The rules are easy. You get a little set of power cards, and there's a little bit of strategy as far as like when you use the big one, you can only use once, or when you use the ones that you can use all the time. And you have fun. They're very challenging. Like, I feel like you win as often as you lose. They're not just, you don't just march through. And you have to work together. It's a cooperative board game. All the bad guys and the dungeon and stuff are generated by in board games, they call it the AI, but it's really like the random deck that tells you what's going on. So I really like these games. The first one, I think, that came out, and the first one that I got anyway, was the Castle Ravenloft board game. And I love the Castle Ravenloft mythos. When I was a kid, that was one of the first Dungeons and Dragons books that I bought and read, was I Strahd, and it was about the vampire and the monster hunter, very, very Dracula in the Dungeons and Dragons world kind of thing. Loved it. I had all the box sets, wanted to play it all the time. This board game came out. We've played through the entire 13 scenario set twice. And what we've started doing is for the last couple of years is every Halloween, not on the day, but that kind of Halloween time, whenever we have time, we'll pick a day and we'll pull out the Castle Ravenloft board game and we'll go fight Strahd. We skip to the last adventure and go see if this Halloween, if we can kill the vampire Strahd. Almost never happens. It's very challenging. So what I thought I would do is start 3D printing all of the tiles, all of the little cards for this game so that this year, when we play it in October, it will be 3-dimensional. Instead of just building the puzzle pieces on a thing, it'll have walls, it'll have crypts, it'll have the tables and the gargoyles and all the stuff on it. And what I discovered while doing this and planning it all out is this game is actually built on a 52 card deck system. So of the little tiles that are in there, there are 52 of them. Okay. And if you look, there are so many ones that are crypts and so many ones that have white triangles versus black triangles. And it all corresponds with face cards and number cards, or the 4 different color cards, or, all of the ones that are hallways and white is the same number of red number cards in a deck of cards. And all the ones that are corners and have deadlier monsters line up with how many black face cards there are in a deck of cards. So when they built this game, I am absolutely sure that it's built on some kind of mechanic used with a traditional playing card set.
Interesting. So will that change your game playing experience, understanding that now and making all these tiles?
It may stick out in my mind, because a lot of the adventures will be contingent upon, when you draw the secret stairway card, that triggers the end event kind of thing. Okay. Right. So I suppose I could kind of count cards and be I know that that's a face card and we've already put down 6 face cards type thing. So it's going to be coming up in the next, I guess I could. I don't know that it will, because when you shuffle cards, unless you're purposefully planting a card or palming a card or something, it's pretty random. It's a randomized thing. So, but it was just interesting that I got that glimpse into the game design by nerding out, nice. Fan wise to level up my game, crank my game up to 11 so that it'll look all super cool when we do it again this year.
And we'll certainly share some of those tiles as you make them as well. I'm sure there are listeners who are interested in the 3D printing pieces. I have finished all of this.
13 tiles so far of just 52 that I need to make.
But that's just printing, right? You haven't started to paint them yet?
Nope, that finished means printed and painted.
Nice. Well, we'll certainly share some of that on our Instagram. For me, the nerdiest thing this week, I could say spending the time to go down those YouTube rabbit holes and finding episodes of these shows, which was pretty nerdy, but I will consider that part of the work of putting together this podcast. So I'm going to say the nerdiest thing I did, I contributed and backed my very first thing on Kickstarter. Now,
oh boy.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the last episode that we are waiting for a Kickstarter for a game called The Dark Tower. And again, I will talk more in detail about this game because it's so good and I can't wait to get it and play it. And we're buttoned up on maybe August, I think is the possible delivery date.
We'll see.
Rob actually got me that as a birthday present a couple of years ago. And
yes, as it was supposed to be delivered
this
now.
July,
it's supposed to be delivered June or July 2021, which is your birthday next week.
Right. And I think I remember I also contributed once the backer kit came out. I contributed and added things like the neoprene board. So we're waiting on that. But I actually created an account and backed a Kickstarter because what Rob has been doing is forwarding me the updates on the Dark Tower game. And I often just scroll down the email to see what else they're promoting. They promoted something that looked good to me. So I backed a game called Skeptics, which is a little bit of a Clue. And it's a game that has the board actually has two different sides. So you can play two different locations and it's a paranormal themed against skeptics. You're trying to prove the skeptics wrong by finding a ghost. So there's little ghost pieces and there's cards of information, like you're playing Clue so that you can get enough clues to figure out what ghost is haunting this area and be able to prove to the skeptics that these ghosts exist. So again, fan of the horror genre, mixing that with getting into RPG and board games much more in the last couple of years means I've backed my first Kickstarter, and I can only imagine it's going to start opening up more to where my shelves start looking like your shelves with tons of games.
That's how they get you. I cannot tell you how many times I've been looking at, an update, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, and their algorithm works great because it always shows you like 3 things at the bottom, products we think you'll like, boo, boo, boo. But you just scroll down a little too far and go, oh, look at those miniatures, click, and then it's over. I'm in.
But which even more magical about that is that the email was sent to you. And I know you are not a big fan of the horror genre. I can't imagine that you would look at very many paranormal themed games, but it was at the bottom of the email you forwarded to me. So I started looking at it. And
I've grown out of this, but I looked at that board game when you said you had backed it, and I'm like, ooh, yeah, look at all those chits. Look at all those little punch out. Look at all that crap. That's not for me. Not anymore. I'm not doing it.
And that is actually something that I think about when I look at games as well. But this one, I don't know, something about this one really, really pieced to me. And actually, I watched the unboxing video because I was there. I think I backed it with 48 hours to go. It picked me up right at the very, very tail end of it, which is probably why the algorithm put it there, because ending soon in the email that you forwarded to me, they actually showed the unboxing, and when they pulled out the thing, the stuff was just falling out. He was like, they're so easy to pop out, and like we've upgraded to this, so once you're not going to have to sit and punch all these out. It's really just they're going to come out. Really
it's just a mess.
I have a big gaming table in my kitchen island, so it won't be a problem. I'm looking forward to it and checking it out and seeing if it's good. But I think that's the nerdiest thing I did this week, which leads us to the content of the next episode. We're going to talk about Kickstarter and the many adventures of Rob in Kickstarter. Kickstarter's really changed. It's changed
the industry for sure. It has opened things up to creators like never before. You don't have to be a big company. And in fact, if you are a big company, this is the way you're doing stuff, because it was never a real money-making, profit-generating business to begin with. So there's a lot to talk about.
And a lot that I want to say in response to that, but we will save it for the next episode.
No.
So I want to thank everyone for listening again. Thank you, Rob, for your wonderful input on 1980s movies and TV shows, and always my best friend. It's great to hang out with you.
So if I were a listener to this show and I wanted to follow what was going on, let's say I enjoy Instagram or Facebook or any kind of social media, what would I do?
Everything is Nerd Best Friends. Twitter @NerdBestFriends, Instagram @NerdBestFriends, Facebook Nerd Best Friends. Everything is spelled out. We are NerdBestFriends at google.com. Feel free to write in.
Gmail.com, right?
Yes, gmail.com.
NerdBestFriends at gmail.com for all of you who cannot believe that I didn't talk about GoBots or your favorite anime, or that we could get through the whole thing about Out of This World and how the theme song was the same theme song as Evangelion. We want to hear from you. There are nerd people.
Yes.
Get in there and tell us what you think were the most influential 80s and 90s movies and TV shows.
What did we miss? There's certainly a whole list of TVs and movies that were made for older people in the 1980s, for people who weren't preteens. So communicate with us, write in, tell us what nerdism movie, TV show you watched. And thank you for listening to our podcast.
All right. Talk to you next time.